Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. I want to thank Leslie and Lauren for taking care of me. I'm getting to eat in some really very nice places. I mean, I shouldn't just say that's the reason I'm here, but it's a bonus. And so tonight what I want to do is, it's not exactly my research. My research is tomorrow, but this is, as Nancy said, something that's near and dear to my heart. And it's kind of, it really goes back to graduate school, when I was the one graduate student in the Department of Plant Pathology at the University of Kentucky, and I was studying small, tiny nematodes. And yet everybody else in plant pathology or entomology was studying things they could either see, or fungi that cause these crippling diseases, or viruses, or really big stuff. And here I am saying, look through the microscope and see this tiny little nematode, and it's going to cause this plant eventually to have a problem. So there wasn't much belief in what these tiny invertebrates did, these microscopic invertebrates. And I kept wondering, well, then how come I look through the microscope and you see something like a head of a nematode like this that sucks in bacteria? This was one of my students, and he went on to look at the sensory organisms, the sensory apparatus around the mouth of a nematode. So that's the head facing you when you look through the microscope. And I kept thinking, well, if they're all this ornate and there's so many thousand species of them, why isn't anybody paying any attention to them? And I guess that's what took me on my career, is I wanted to give them some attention. But tonight what I want to do is just talk about all the life in soil. And I'm going to particularly pay attention to some bacteria. I'm going to also talk about archaea, but this is in a kind of a broad scope about how far we've come and why I think soil ecology and soil biology and soils and ecosystem science and above and below ground, thinking really about what's in soils, is the big emerging frontier, and why we need to study it so much. So let's just go back to what we all know, which is that biodiversity provides numerous benefits to us. And we study biodiversity in many different ways. We define it in many different ways, landscapes. But in general, for the most part, unless we have a coal, or we're looking at something in our refrigerator that turns green, we're pretty well thinking about things that we can see. And when we do that, I think we let out a lot of other life. Just think back about oceans. We used to use oceans for a dump. We would throw things in oceans. People didn't think about it. They still do it if you go to some places. And yet, we now know there's a huge amount of life in there, not just for food, but unseen biodiversity that's doing something. It's part of a huge food chain. And that's exactly the way we need to think about soils. And soils not only sustain the biodiversity we see above ground, but think back about history and human civilizations, and the civilizations that may have failed because they didn't take care of their soils. They just used them up, or they moved on, slash and burn agriculture. I mean, we see lots of examples of not taking care of soils because it's just brown dirt, right? Why do you need to be thinking, oh, instead of walking across the floor when you're a kid, or even now, stomp that bug? We're not thinking about what's in the soil. And I think that's really, really wrong, because we can't live without what's in the soils beneath our feet. And I don't think we can be healthy. And when we think about the future, and sustainability is our future, we have to consider what soils and the organisms in soils do for us. So that's what we're going to do today. First of all, I want you to know the status of soils. We don't think about that very much, but I'm just going to give you some highlights here. We're really in trouble with our soils. In Africa, for example, they're thinking about, do we have enough soils that are fertile? Or do we start moving into marginal soils, soils we wouldn't have thought about growing anything? But about 33% of soils are degraded. We have dust storms all over the world now. I mean, this is just one that, was 2011. But if people are getting used to these dust storms. China, they're all over the world where these dust storms are occurring. We had the Dust Bowl, we're familiar with that. And I think, you know, when we go back to something like the Dust Bowl and you think about how a nation's economy, it goes back to if we sustain our soils, we sustain the civilization. If we pay attention and don't destroy soils that feed and purify the water as it goes through the soil, all the organisms that are in the soil, the roots, everything that's going on in our connections above and below ground. Well, it hasn't been so easy to study soils. But nevertheless, this was 2015, December 2015, there was an assessment, and they categorized the world's soils as being pretty poor. So now we had in 2015 also thinking about the future, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals. And there are a lot of P's up here, people, prosperity. This is what we want our future to look like. We would really like it so we have a planet that protects our natural resources so we can continue to use them and we all get to use them, but they keep going. We don't want to wipe them out. We don't want soils to be degraded. We don't want water quality to be degraded. We want enough water. And so they came up with 17, this is the nations of the world, 17 goals. And I'm not going to go through each one of them, but I think if you go and look at some of these, they are really tied to soil. They may not say soil up there, but hunger, we've already talked about, or I've already talked about, good health and well-being. Thinking about countries that have soil-transmitted helminths in the soil. We know very little about those helminths and how these are worms, different types of worms, and how they affect wildlife, say in Africa and the plains of Africa, how these things are transmitted to humans, what kind of diseases they cause. They're big in the World Health Organization. But you can come down here also and look at things about life below water and consider what we pour into soils, how it gets to the Gulf of Mexico, what has happened to the ability of the organisms in soil to take care of detoxifying those types of things. So many of the Sustainable Development Goals are really linked to how we take care of our soils. And right now, in the last 15 years or so, it has been a real awakening about soils. And that's because many of the global problems, the environmental challenges that we have, like climate change, is tied to soil. Soils store carbon, quite a bit of carbon. So there's a big push in agriculture. How do we store more carbon in soils? Desertification, I mentioned. How do we keep soils from being torn up and blowing? What are ways to stop erosion? What are many different ways other than just physical? I mentioned health. They're talking about allergies now. There's papers coming out now that they're looking at the distance kids grow up from actual handling soils, moving the good things that you get from soils, the good organisms that help you become immune. The Convention on Biological Diversity was one of the first to say soil biodiversity is really key to helping us have good food, good agriculture. We got to pay attention to it. And of course, food I've mentioned. So all these different things have been studied in splintered groups, but nevertheless, soil's at the center of it. And so a global soil partnership was formed just about 3 or 4 years ago. And it's based in Rome, and what it does is try to come up with how can we sustainably manage soils voluntarily. And I would say here also that there's been recognition in places you wouldn't think about. Europe, their contribution to the Convention on Biological Diversity, the extinction of species, the loss of species, was soil biodiversity. They are so concerned about losing the biodiversity in soils because they know it helps keep the soils fertile, helps keeps carbon in the soil, and so many other reasons. So what we're going to do now, that I've given this little preamble, is talk about the biodiversity in soil. Here's some evidence for you that there's been some change. This is a Web of Science. It's not always the best record to do, but just taking the word soil biodiversity and then running it since 1988 to December last year, you can see soil biodiversity and sustainability, the number of publications that, and we threw out things like just reports. Ecosystem processes, ecosystem functions, soil biodiversity is being studied by a lot of ecologists. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. In other areas, it's not. Land degradation, it hasn't picked up. Ecosystem services, a lot more papers, a lot more people are looking at it. So why is there this interest by scientists, ecologists, starting to look at this? Well, you can say that we've got a lot of information that we could also look at it with. We may not have who the species, et cetera, but look how far we've come in thinking about if we had a global map, or if we knew where species were and what they were doing, how it might benefit us in terms of land cover. How do you keep the soils resilient? Are there certain organisms that help with that? Soil types, will it work better in one soil type than another? Food, all these things we could do it. And so we think, and I'm going to show you, that we were able to come up with, a lot of us were able to come up with that missing map. And now we think we can go some places with it. So why this interest? And here's the reason why there's so many ecologists and other people. We've got molecular techniques that we can use now. We take soil samples and we can identify things. Before, soil was a black box. It was just like Diana studies nematodes, and I only study a few of those because I don't know all of them. There's somebody else in Russia that may study them. I mean, how many people here ever met somebody who studies all the species or groups of species, maybe earthworms? The other thing we've got is we've been doing a lot more spatial and temporal studies, looking at soil organisms, looking at ecosystem processes, finding out the relationship. We have global experiments, collaborative now, that we couldn't have before, not just because of the internet or Skype, but because we can get together and say, we're standardizing the methods, so we're not going to mess around with, if you look at millipedes, you use your method, we'll use our method over here for nematodes, and then we'll try to put all this data together, and it's really hard to do. Instead, we can say we can run some molecular methods with this and find out who's in the soil. We can look at various genes, and it's not all that hard to type back to what they look like morphologically. So what I want to talk about now is, does it matter? What have we found out? Some evidence to show you what we know. Are there threats to soils and soil biodiversity? I've already told you that there are, or the EU, the European Union, wouldn't have made soil biodiversity its contribution to the Convention on learning about it, to the Convention on Biological Diversity. And what's going on about how we use this knowledge either to protect or to manage soil biodiversity, so we are sustaining the soils in a more important way. So, question, does soil life matter? First of all, we got to know who's there. And as I just told you, until about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, I knew what nematodes, but imagine taking a soil core and I have to count and identify all the earthworms, millipedes, centipedes, you know those little pill bugs or isopods, all the different species of those. Then I go to everybody's favorite water bears, if you don't know water bears. Water bears, rotifers, tardigrades, and oh, by the way, then there's all the bacteria, archaea, and fungi. It's really difficult to do that. So you become a specialist and isolated. So who is there? We're able to look at that now. What do they do for us? I'm telling you, I'm going to show you some really good papers, just examples. And I apologize if I'm not using your paper. I'm not using all of mine either. But I just want to show you some examples that you can kind of write down and take home and think about. And then, if we already know these soils are threatened, does it really matter that the biodiversity is changing in soils? And so I hope to answer those and then tell you kind of an initiative that's pretty cool. So, who's there? 1/4, this is a better estimate than we've ever had. Wim van der Putten and Richard Bargett did it. 1/4 of the living diversity in Earth is below ground. Well, right there is a reason a lot of ecologists stopped looking. I mean, I know a lot who did. We know it's now a very active habitat. It's not just static. You can find different things over time. But look how many organisms, and look in a handful of soil, what the estimate is now for the number of taxa. Again, daunting, but we're not worried. Because we put everything's in a food web. Now this is the carbon source over here. Whoop, I did the wrong one. This is the carbon source right there, and it can be a dead body. Those are good. Somebody's got to decay everything in a cemetery, right? So it could be carbon, or it could be roots. And then we've got all these things that start feeding on that, whether it's roots or whether it's dead organic matter. And the food web builds, and things eat each other, and it is huge. But we haven't known anything except these are boxes. We didn't really know that there were how many species were in each one. And we're starting to crack into that. And what's so great about it is we've got predators. And I like to think about these just as I think above ground. Take your wolves. Pick whatever you want to in Africa. We've got predators in soil that when we disturb a soil, that food web reduces down to about 2 to 3 levels. The predators seem to be the first things to go. And I can give you some evidence on that later, but not yet. We're going to say who is there. This is a molecular study of these invertebrates. And so we're looking at arthropods, annelids, chordates, nematodes, gastroctrix, flatworms, rotifers, everybody's favorite tardigrades. And we did from Alaska to Argentina, Sweden to South Africa, took samples. We did it morphologically, we did it molecularly, and we're able to see that almost all the soil animals, this is the bottom line here, found at only a single location, suggesting that most soil animals have restricted distributions, they're endemic. This is, the numbers of studies that are now showing this is quite different because we only looked at the trophic group or the functional group. We've got earthworms. We've got parasites. But we didn't see who was in that box to know whether they were different from continent to continent. So we know a lot now on this scale, but these are the invertebrates. We have proceeded past this thing about all species do not occur everywhere to things like this one at Central Park that we did. Why would we want to go to Central Park? It's an urban system. Well, parks may be homogenized. Everything's supposed to look the same. But we wanted people who might care about soil biodiversity. We kept saying, we've been working all these places, and so one day, a bunch of us said, let's figure out how to do this in Central Park. Kelly Ramirez, my postdoc at the time, organized this, and Noah Ferrer's lab, Mark Bradford's lab. We all showed up in one hotel room, basically. The next day we went out, and all those red dots are the samples that we took and GPS'd. And we then took those soil samples back, and to get your name on the paper, you had to do some sort of work. And so some people did soil carbon, some people did soil nitrogen. We got all this done. This one was an advance because molecularly, using a tool that we knew about, we're actually doing bacteria in all the eukaryotes. So fungi in all those animals out of one soil sample. That I never thought I would ever see. You don't have to have all the specialists from all over the world that work on millipedes in one room saying what's there. We're able to do it. I'm not going to say it's perfect, but we're getting there. What did we find? Most of the species were unknown. The OTUs were unknown. And we found as many different types in that one big area, 3 miles long and maybe a 1/4 mile wide in Central Park, as you might find similar types around the world. I hope that makes sense. In other words, we're not saying they're the same species around the world, but the same types were found. Why is this important? Well, we could tell you what the history of that thing was all the way back to 1930-something, when they first came in, and we knew where the plants went, when they quit watering, we knew all the disturbances. And again, we're doing all the biodiversity in soil. But we've been able to use this data. Here's an example of NOAA's and Rob Jackson's, where they're just looking at what factors determine on a continental scale where soil bacteria are of the various ecosystems like forest and dry forest and grasslands. And then they're looking at how soil pH matched that. So soil pH at this study, when they looked at these samples, was one of the main drivers of increased biogeography of bacteria. Here's one from Rob Griffiths in 2011. I really like this one. Again, it's everything, bacteria and eukaryotes. And then he took the bacteria and mapped them across the land uses. This is cities to dairy to hills. But more importantly, they looked at how it maps with soil carbon. And we could go further than that. So these are predictive maps that help people know how do we expand land. Do we want to keep expanding our land into hot spots of diversity if they don't matter, if they're not the same above ground as they are below ground? It seems that more diversity below ground is dependent on what that soil legacy was, how the geology, what it has become, and how we've treated it. So what do they do for us? This is just a meta-analysis summarizing a lot of different studies that were standardized and looked at across the world, and most of these were litter bag studies, so you may know the problems with some of those. But nevertheless, of these about 130 sites, we looked at whether soil fauna made a difference or did not make or made a difference, did not make or made a difference. We found that in those scales that we're looking at, we had an average of 27% difference if the soil fauna were present. So that's another example. Looking at ecosystems again, this is from boreal forest, tropical forest, Arctic. So everything on this side or to the right of the dotted line is something forestry or prairie. Everything to the left, the little triangles, are cold and hot desert. And it's just very simple that the genes that are expressed for function are very different in other biomes that have more recalcitrant carbon. They're much more for, here you see nitrogen, phosphorus cycling, whereas in deserts it's a lot for survival. Well, the other thing that has been quite interesting is there's a whole block of scientists studying disease. I mentioned helminths. These are a lot of species that are in soil that you're familiar with, particularly some that I knew when I was studying plant pathology, and many of those cause diseases. I got particularly interested in this because when I grew up in Kentucky, I had histoplasmosis, and I never knew I had a fungal disease in my lungs until I was about, well, when I got to California and started swimming a lot outside, and I had got pneumonia. I got it twice, and I went to the doctor, and the doctor looked at my scar on my lungs, and he says, "Oh, you from the Ohio River Valley?" Yeah, well, these doctors and geo-doctors seem to know a lot about these organisms, their life cycles, but we don't put it together with what is the ecology, what is the disturbance, what has been going on in those particular soils. We also don't think about the beneficial things. It's really nice to have bee people here. I just checked this today. I didn't want to give a slide up here that was wrong, but we have bees and we don't think about all the above ground creatures that have to have soil as part of its life cycle. And so some of the bees also do this. Now here's one that I really urge you to read if you haven't looked at this. This is Francesca de Vries in A Cast of Thousands. These were plots all across Europe, north to south. They looked at managed and unmanaged grasslands. They said they were going to use the best techniques for protozoa for everything that they could find in the soil. So it was many universities, many graduate students. The project was called EcoFinders. It probably cost the EU a lot of money. But you can see that when they broke everything into functional groups also. But, you know, they've got flagellates down here in small print and fungivorous columbella and all that. But they also looked at carbon, nitrogen, everything you would do if you were doing an ecosystem study. And this is their conclusion. There are several papers that came out of that, but it's really worth looking at how they did the study and what they found, because it's one of the first times that we could really see the tie between a lot of soil in one place to a particular process. And I'm not saying in every case that bacteria are not important by any means, because they're the first defense or the first actors on a system. But these fungal energy channels that they looked at showed that they were more resilient. Everything that came through the funnel compared to the bacterial was much more resilient. So to cut to the chase here, some of the evidence that's come in the last 10 to 15 years has shown different ways that soil organisms are important to above ground systems and to us than we had thought about before. And these are just a few. Now, what about the threats? The threats are pretty major. I've mentioned most of them, but things we don't think a lot about, and they're thinking about in Europe, which is making, at least in the West, we're thinking about them, is the one soil sealing, where we put our concrete down. How do we build our cities? Why do we want to build them on some of our best soils? And those soils may be space for wildlife that may carry things. It's not just for the soil organisms. It's thinking of the soil organisms as part of the whole ecosystem. This paper is another one of a lot of people, mostly in Europe, that looked at the effect of intensive agriculture on soil organisms. There have also been papers on the extinction risk of soil biota. Things you wouldn't have thought, I wouldn't have thought, I would have never dreamed that we would see those kind of papers. And we also have NGOs calling, like the Nature Conservancy and others calling about how do we conserve and preserve soil. Do we do it based on hotspots of biodiversity above ground in the tropics or not? We know that when we have agricultural systems, and I alluded to this, with high soil biodiversity, they're more sustainable with more of this because they control the pests and the pathogens than in intensive systems. But a lot of drivers now are changing these. Climate change in deposition can affect these and make these intensive systems have lower biodiversity. And that also plays back into human health, animal health, and us. And here's a graph that I like from Rodolfo Dirzo, where he looked at just decreases in abundance of soil organisms. That wasn't the whole point of the paper, but this is high abundance of dung beetles and low, and there's less dung removed. And over here, this is some work we did in Antarctica looking at high levels of nematodes and low levels of nematodes, and we found there was less CO2 production. So a lot of these are being looked at. So now what has happened was, because the soil is at the center, we have the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative that a number of us said there's now enough science that we need to be adding this to either management or passing it to policymakers by region. And this is just a summary kind of what I've been talking about. We know there are key regulators. We, by any means, don't know anything, but the knowledge we've got has been tremendous. I think there's a big emphasis on soil health worldwide, and what is soil health and how do you look at that. But nevertheless, most soil biodiversity is still left out of policy agendas. And linking the diversity, not just soils. People think soils and they think Mars, they think dead. Our soils are not dead. They're interactive and dynamic. And so this Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative started in 2011. It is now recognized by the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Soil Partnership, FAO. And just to give you an example of, I mentioned that I think it's an emerging field. We had our first meeting ever of the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative in Dijon, France, 2 years ago. We expected maybe 200 of my best friends, And we got 700 people, 65% of them were younger than 40. All new scientists seeing this is we're not scared of going into dirt and seeing where it is and going beyond 10 centimeters. We're going to look at how soil functions. So it's a very exciting time. We were able, for this Global Soil Biodiversity Atlas, to bring a lot of these international people together. We predicted this includes invasive species. You can go to the atlas, it's free. I'll give you the website just now. You can get anything out of it you want to. We made it, and it's published for policymakers, primarily for the public. But this is the big step, and there's also a scientific paper that Alberto wrote on how they put this together, how we got all this done. But this includes a lot of those threats that I mentioned. Here's the idea about the PDF. Just probably look up Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative. But it was also amazing to us, if you look down here, that I think this was in 6 months, we had 125 million social media views, and that was a shock. We usually don't think we have that many. It wasn't just me clicking. It was launched to the Australian Parliament, the French Academy of Agriculture, the Brazilian Soil Science. It was launched at AAAS. It was launched in Scotland at the James Hutton Institute. They had the parliamentarians come. Its time has come, and we're moving forward. We wrote Kelly Ramirez, who was the first executive director, my postdoc, of the GSBI. We got together with a lot of people from the Synthesis Center at Leipzig, Germany, that's DIV, if you know of that. Had a couple of workshops and got people together and say, the people that have most of this data are dying, or it's on their shelves in little vials. How are we going to get all this data together? Not just the molecular data, but how are we going to put this to look at a global database? And that's that paper, and now there's another workshop Nico Eisenhower is running with a lot of people, and earthworms are going to be the first thing we're going to try to do to see if we can't link data together, and then what will we do with it, and how will we advise on it. A lot of these papers are also tying. You know, we get papers from people like Thomas Crowther who say, you know, I'm really got some soil biodiversity data. I really want to do this under the GSBI because it's going to have a much more greater impact if we do it by region, or he's got ideas on what warming will do. This worm group is the one that we're going to be seeing a lot of people at to move forward. The other thing is that the EU Joint Research Council has just talked to us and said they would very much like to see us move beyond and consider an assessment of global soil biodiversity of some kind per region with its ecosystem services and its function. So that's something that the advisory committee is discussing. In October, and this I put up here because we just got this off the web, it's not cheap, but they also have on the web that they're giving money for students to go there if you get an oral presentation. This is going to be the second one. I don't know if it's also with the China microbiome, soil microbiome meeting. And we don't know if it's going to be as big, but if not, put on your calendar that we hope the one is the next year. Following, the third one would be, I'm working on Richard Bargett. I want it at the University of Manchester because I think he's going to be president of the British Ecological Society of America and British Ecological Society. That was awful. And I figure he's going to have lots of help in that 1 year, and that would be a year to try to have it there. He kind of knows that, but not further. Okay, but what is really important is considering, and this has been great. We've had people like Johan Six and Keith Postian and just people who work solely on the soil carbon or soil physical and chemical characteristics. A soil scientist. We had a launch at the Soil Science Society of America. We've had a lot of real good support from the Soil Science Society of America. And we're talking about how will we do this. So this is another reason, even if you just want to to download this picture and look at how we suggest, and all the advisors, on how to manage and protect soil biodiversity. There's some text, there's a lot of text in this book to go with each one of these figures. I also wanted to show you something from one of our collaborators, partners, and you can download this. And this was tried out first in the Jornada, New Mexico, in that desert, then also in South Africa and in Kenya. People using this, and how would they look at how do they look at the landscape? It's got little pictures on it. You know, how big are your plants? Click. Then you go to it, and what's the slope? Click. How much organic matter do you have on it? You know, you put in a little thumbprint. And you keep going, and it comes up to how could you manage that patch of land more sustainably? And then they want to have feedback because they're testing this. So this is free. It's USDA, paid for it. All the postdocs that are working over at Boulder and at Las Cruces have really been working on this, and then the people in Africa have been informing this. So, you know I would, and Jeff Herrick would love to hear this. Hear how you think about it. I think I'm going to go back now and think about this and hope that I have kind of transformed your brain a little bit if you already weren't there. I'm not saying by any means that we have everything done. There's some great papers out there. We've got a long way to go. But I think unraveling some of these things that we've kept in boxes for a long time, and I mean a long time, for both natural systems and agricultural systems, is really an exciting time to be involved in research. So the Global Soil Biodiversity Initiative, we have blogs. Read them. There's some great ones now. The one today is, I think, Rachel Kramer from Wageningen University on soil health. We get a lot of hits on those. But again, most people who are interested in this and carving out part of their life to work on this are not only excited about the science and where it is, but what the ecology of knowing these organisms is going to tell us about the Sustainability Development Goals. And so we know these goals are challenging. We know there's lots of species beneath our feet, and their numbers are enormous. But I think it's a really exciting time to be looking at these and trying to relate them to ecosystem functions and biogeography and evolutionary biology. Thank you very much. Questions?
Yeah, we have time for questions. I wanted to remind you guys that there's a social tonight, 1670 East, 1500 North. Okay, questions?
And I don't know if I can answer them all, but somebody here may be able to answer them. Yeah.
So you talked about some of the collaboration on studying global soil biodiversity. What do you see? Do you see that there are challenges and barriers, and what are those barriers to collaborating on getting a greater understanding of global soil biodiversity?
I think that's really an important question. I mean, I know every speaker says that, but this one's really important. The reason it's really important is we got a lot of barriers. Soil, series, and types are not the same by every country. So that's a big thing. When I go in and I want to say X, they're saying, we don't have that one here. So, how do you do that? And so Gates, about 10 years ago, put in, I've forgotten how many $1 million for a global, what was it called? It was a global data soil map.org. And one of the things, he started in Africa. It was really, if you go and you look at, Pedro Sanchez was involved. It went to Colombia. They had a really big group that was working in South Africa on the soils. The sampling was hugely rigorous. The types of analyses that were run in Africa, amazing. And of course, I was just really mad that they weren't doing soil biodiversity while they were doing all this other stuff. So I found somebody who gave me and Noah Ferrer enough money to hire a postdoc in Africa to go in. I don't know why I sidelined on this, but soil biodiversity was not in theirs. And so we got samples that we could run, but we couldn't do as much with them. The reason that's important is because they were doing it across country. And they were going to make it digital, kind of like just any app, so that you could hit it and go. They've made some progress, but in the meantime, the EU has put out a soils map of Africa. Whether or not people use that and describe their soils right off the bat for carbon, what the habitat's like, what we would know is, an oxysol or whatever, very different. So that's a huge barrier, number one. Number two is just national politics. I was in South Africa. A guy at the University of Pretoria, we'd been working 3 years on a USAID grant for them to bring a lot of countries together that would bring soil samples, and they would all get, this is for bacteria and archaea, that would get run for soil microbes, let's say. The woman from Zimbabwe couldn't play because U.S. doesn't fund Zimbabwe, so he found some other money so she could go take those soil samples, but then she was considered registered as a foreign scientist, and she had to get permission. So it's just internal politics in some nations make it very different. We're collaborating with her, but she's having a tough time getting the soil samples. I mean, the biggest barrier I saw right away is if I work in country, if I'm in Kenya taking samples, that's one thing. But if I want to work cross and compare, that took a whole lot of what little money we had, was just to help people get their samples shipped or brought to a border where we could get them. So that's the second thing. Third is I think that the techniques are changing so rapidly. I think that it's, you really have to be intense or know somebody or collaborate with somebody who can help you put together what you want to see. And most of these are hypothesis driven. I mean, let's face it, nobody wants to go out and how many 100,000 soil samples can we take and what's in them? You have to have some questions and have to be kind of judicious given the amount of money compared to all the other global issues that we've got going on. And so I think that's why collaborations happen, is because we want to maximize the amount of money we've got. I don't know if that answers everything, but those are the biggest ones I see right off the bat. Yes, sir?
You mentioned that soil systems are static. I mean,
not static, yeah.
They're not, sorry.
Yeah.
They're not static,
Mm-hmm.
and then you also mentioned from the stuff in even in Central Park, they're highly diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Does that then present problems with actually detecting change?
Yeah, it does, because a lot of the stuff we're doing is snapshots in time. But I think it's hard because when I'm working like in Antarctica, we're looking over years and seeing change. But yeah, I think it's a problem because we're making decisions and suggesting things. We're not making the decisions. We're seeing things and saying, this is what we've got, and this may be of more interest than that. Or making even decisions on where or is there a latitudinal gradient. And for most of these soil invertebrates, we're not seeing that it matches the tropics at all, that there's higher there. So some of these, long answer is it's a problem because we don't have enough money to do something over a short period of time or whatever. And usually you would do it with probably an ecosystem process or some measure of nitrogen or phosphorus or whatever. On the reverse is we haven't ever had that information before, and maybe we'll have something that's really unique rather than, well, my trophic structure looks like it did in the other grassland. We've got a little bit more depth to look at it.
Oh, sorry, I just realized I lost my voice. So there's been a big push recently to assess soil health.
Mm-hmm.
And with soils being so diverse, how can you compare soil health of like an entisol to a mollisol and a grassland?
Yep.
And they're so different. What parameters do you think are the most important?
I won't go there. I would say go read that blog. And the reason I won't say there is because we pretty well decided there's not going to be a global soil biodiversity index at all. Everything, Johan Six is collaborator, and I've learned a lot about, from talking with him, and He's working in the Cameroon right now, and he doesn't mess around with, first of all, if you disturb anything, you're breaking up the aggregates of soil, you're losing the carbon. So you want to keep the small soil aggregates, but in some of these soils that you're talking about, small soil aggregates may actually have huge diversity of bacteria or fungi. And so we're thinking more, right now I showed you a lot of global because that's what we're doing, but I think where any recommendations are going to come from what is known about that region. And of course there are going to be people that go down and say, well, this soil type on this field versus that one. I mean, I say that when I was in California, we were very aware, growers are aware. I mean, you're not going to fool anybody. This nematode occurs in that side of the field because the soil is X type, and this one occurs over here. So, at that scale, but just going up, what can you make for regional areas? And where, for example, would a soil type of a helminth occur in India? What type of soil? Is it more clay? Is there something that we can tell people that will help them when they're thinking about human health or anything else? Yes, ma'am.
So, 33, I think you said 33% of the soils are degraded. Are those revivable, or should we be focusing on protecting what we got as opposed to repairing what we screwed up?
Yeah, well, I think restoration is huge. I mean, we've got to think about that. I mean, I hope there's a whole, if I was really king, I would say, I want a whole bunch of scientists really excited about ways to restore soil. You're not going to get the same biodiversity back, but let's restore functions and get a diversity so there's more resilience there. On the idea of whether or not this is classified by the UN, the 33%, is done by satellite and this and reporting and all that. And it's UNCCD, the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. And some of it is going to be irreparable on slopes, rocky slopes where they've managed to maintain, but now it's really getting torn up. And I can't tell you the 2 percentages. I could try to find out, but I know that there's one that we will try to restore that. We will prevent more from happening. And some of it, let's face it, is weather. And with climate patterns going, we've got to be ready for all sorts of scenarios. That isn't a good answer, but yeah, it's not all the 33%. Mm-hmm.
Follow up on that, what's being done to incorporate this idea of the importance of soil biodiversity into restoration?
A lot. I mean, a lot compared to what, everything's relative. It's like, okay, when you were a kid, you've grown a lot. And that's kind of the way I feel about what's going on with restoration. I think that the papers that are coming out, and it's really good for me because the postdoc that I have now, who acts as, well, she's the executive director. She handles all these different things, but her papers are on soil restoration, and she's worked with Sarah Baer, who you may know, and Johan also, and she's looking a lot at not only soil health, but how the whole food chain can be rebuilt. How do you rebuild a food web, not necessarily just the mycorrhizae or the seeds or the whatever. You need the roots, you need the whole complement of something there, and then you don't want to have just one each in your little box. You want to see if you can't build a whole box full of some species that are interacting there. In fact, just thought of this. The USDA just hired before Christmas, I think he's called a soil biodiversity person, and he is trying to find out what we need to do. I mean, I wish he was going to give us money, but no. What in general, when we're thinking about restoration and soil health, what are some ideas that we hear about? And he's going to, he's obviously talking to other scientific societies and putting it all together. So there's much more, and I would just add to that never in my life I thought, my colleagues and myself, Richard Bargett was invited to a parliamentary committee to stand there and talk about soil biodiversity. And he was like, wow, imagine that. And then the White House had OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, had about 2 or 3 meetings last year, and then the Academy had a couple in one of their boards where they had a symposium and people came and talked about, what were the upcoming issues and what were avenues, and soil biodiversity was, and I'm saying soil biodiversity, but I mean soil biodiversity and function, ecosystem function. You just don't want a smattering of species there that do nothing. So. Mm-hmm.
You said there have been calls to consider soil biota in carbon and nutrient cycling in soils.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just thinking, currently we struggle with incorporating microbial processes
Yeah.
into soil carbon models. And if we have to incorporate
Fauna?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I've been there. Yeah, no, I'll tell you, it's actually, again, I don't know whether it's going to go anywhere, but up till now, everybody said, at the Natural Resource Ecology Laboratory, I've been there for years and years and years, and there are modelers all around me who work on soil carbon, Bill Parton and, Keith Postian and all those guys, and they would, up until about 5 years ago, and then they started thinking, well, we still got some slop in our models. Why is that we've got the slop in the models? And then there's Will Weeder. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he's over at NCAR. He came, he's thinking about it. Pete Smith at Rothamsted is more into it. There's an international soil modeling consortium that didn't even exist until about 3 years ago. It's off and running, and they want a soil biodiversity component to see how they could do it. And I'm going with what I understand that they told me. It may not be exactly what they were trying to tell me. But what I understand is if you took something like you wanted to look at aggregates and storage of carbon, and you had to take the animals that are in soil or whatever's in soil, and you gave annelids that go vertically a higher mark in the model, a number, just 1, and that it would change in certain periods of time over a year. Would that help them understand how carbon is moved and stored in a model? So there's different people looking at different things, and you ought to go look. I don't know how much there is now, but there are more papers on it than I've seen in a long time. Mark Bradford, I think, had something on it. There was a special issue of SBB, of Soil Biology and Biochemistry. I think he's got something in it. And I'm not an expert at all. I'm just hearing them come back to me and say, well, now, if we were really going to crack into it and make a little difference in what we're seeing, this would be the place to do it. And I know microbes are a huge problem, and so are fungi in putting those into those models. I don't do it. I just know they haven't done it up until recently, and now to see this International Soil Modeling Consortium, it's really kind of interesting that they're interested in the life now. Mm-hmm.
If you're going to try to be restoring soils and you want to maybe you're moving soils from one place to another, how do you balance that risk between potentially introducing something, a pathogen or something like that?
Yeah, that drives me nuts.
The beneficial mix.
Yeah, that drives me nuts. No, I don't, just because my background is plant pathology. I just go really nervous when people say they're moving their plant from Florida to, a citrus tree from Florida. I was telling them last night about this rich guy in Palm Beach many years ago when I was at Riverside, and he put his favorite tree on his plane and flew it to Palm Springs. And of course, we had quarantines on that particular nematode pest. And so his Palm Springs trees, young seedlings, started wilting. And yet he brought all the soil with it, and he's wondering what in the heck, and he turns the sprinklers on it. Well, the nematodes move in water. And so my colleague, who was the extension agent at Riverside, went out to Palm Springs, and he came back and he said, oh my God, if I call up Sacramento and tell them what this guy's got and how many of this particular nematode species, they're going to come down, put tarp over the whole house, all these acres, and blow it up. And instead, what they did was he had to dig up all around his swimming pool. I've forgotten, it was something like an acre of soil that they had to bulldoze up, sterilize the bulldozer handles, put it into a dump truck right there and fumigate it right in front of them. So anybody who says restoring soil by moving large volumes really makes me nervous. And I think you're also messing with the soil structure, which is the habitat of what you want to, you're not, they made a mistake at Biosphere 2, remember? They flipped the soil. Organic matter on the bottom, you don't do that kind of stuff anymore.